this Department of Gerontology here in Haifa, in the University of Haifa. Most of the audience here knows me. I think most of them were my students. So I would like, really, I have the honor to present Professor Simon Biggs, Professor of Gerontology and Social Policy. Professor Biggs was a director of the Institute of Gerontology, King's College, London, UK. Since September 2010, he has worked in Australia as the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence Professor of Gerontology and Social Policy at the School of Social and Political Science, Melbourne University. He was, lately, he lives in Finland, yeah? So, from 2008 to 2014, he was a founding member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council of Aging Societies. He was elected as the fellow of the British Academy of Social Science in 2016 and is an advisory board member of the Danish National Center for Social Research. His lecture today will be on reflection on the future of aging and gerontology, negotiation, and the interconnection. Please, Professor Biggs.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me today to celebrate with you 20 years of this such an important course, and the influence that it's had nationally and internationally can't be underestimated. I'm going to start today. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Because I'm unlike some New Yorkers in the audience. I'm a Londoner and I tend to mumble. So if I'm mumbling, sort of wave your hands and I'll try and speak louder. I'm going to start with something familiar and then move on to some of the consequences of that. And I'm really trying to focus in the end on how we can negotiate and interconnect around issues of aging and gerontology. There is a... Could you just, Tova, could you just remove this instruction from the page? Okay, so I'm going to start with something that should be very familiar, and I'm just going to flick through it quite quickly, and this is the changing demographic landscape. So this was the world in 2000, and this is what the world looks like in 2030. So if you look at that map, you can see the darker it gets, the greater proportion of older people. In the European Union, you can see that it's moving from 2010 to 2050 to a quite different demographic shape. And this is driving a lot of our policy thinking on what to do about aging. The United States, roughly the same shape again. And you can see this also as a matter of speed. So some countries are aging much more quickly than others. And I'll be mostly talking about the advanced economies in what could be called the global north. But as you can see from this graph, the issues that we're addressing are becoming increasingly important across the globe. When we look at Israel, you can see that you're in a transition. You've still got what we think of as the demographic triangle, at least in 2016. But if we go ahead to 2050, you can see that the shape of the Israeli population is changing dramatically. And in fact, you could say that all of the countries that we're dealing with have moved from a triangle, from a traditional society with a lot of children who die off reasonably quickly and leave a few elders, to a demographic column where most generations are going to be the same size. And that is one of the things we're really having to tangle with. And if you're a policymaker, particularly if you're involved in fiscal studies, your great concern is that we'll move from a triangle to a column to an unstable trapezium on the end there, which will bring the whole place down. But the demographic challenge is very familiar to us all. I think what is really important now for us as people who are students of aging and of gerontology is, what's the cultural challenge? We know there's a demographic challenge, but how can we address this? We're moving from a triangle to a column. We're living longer lives, which is driving that demographic change of shape. So generations are becoming about the same size, and we need to adapt. I sort of took a long time to write the book that's there, but I came out with some fairly simple conclusions. And those are that the core questions that we need to address are, what is the purpose of a long life? How do we adapt to a society where generations will be approximately the same size? And we're starting from a base where everybody wants to live a long life, but nobody wants to grow old. So how do we engage with that as a cultural phenomenon? And I think whilst a lot of these trends are becoming much more familiar, particularly to policymakers, there are trends which are becoming amplified as we travel through 2019. The demographics of population aging are well known. But cultural adaptation has been slow to gain momentum beyond notions of continuing to stay as we are for as long as possible, and this has been translated into continuing to work and adopting a lifestyle in midlife which you keep going for as long as you possibly can. But that exists now in a background of a deployment, often a political deployment, of generational rivalry, pitting one generation against another, which is leading to a situation of increasingly precarious aging. Just as youth and the people who are migrating from one country to another are leading precarious lives, increasingly as we look at aging, our assumptions about what it means to grow old, the certainties we used to rely on, are also becoming precarious. And then there's a growing concern about dementia, which I won't be covering today. But we're not starting from a blank slate. In fact, the economic solution has been kicking around for a good few years now, and this is the notion that if we all work longer, it'll be fine. Fewer pensions, more workers mean more taxes, which then mean we don't have to pay more pensions and so on. So if you're sitting in the Treasury and you look at demographic aging, you think, oh yeah, this is good, we can keep going. Now you have to put that within the context of an alternative narrative, which is about what happens as we grow and change across the life course as humans. This is just one model. It's a very familiar model by Erickson, but it basically makes the point that as we grow and develop through the life course, right up until deep old age, we have a changing psychosocial series of priorities that face us, and we need to deal with those. And what this does is it puts into question the notion of continuity. So I think at the very heart of the way we think about population aging, we have this tension. On the one hand, work, keep it continuous, not a lot of attention to the quality of the work that is actually available to older workers. And on the other hand, this notion that as we grow, we change, we develop capacities perhaps that we haven't been able to develop whilst we were in working life. And finally then, this notion, the third element, is this precarity, which is creeping in to this more uncertain world of aging that we face. In many countries, statutory retirement age is being lengthened. There are questions over the availability and forms of work that are available to older workers. There's an often inadequate and unaffordable housing for older people and care facilities. These were mentioned by the excellent panel we had at the beginning of the session today. And there may not be the predictability of a long life that many in advanced economies had come to expect. So we're moving into this uncertain world where the prospect of a long life becomes increasingly difficult to navigate. So we need some tools to make sense of what is going on in this situation. Now, if uncertainty wasn't a challenge enough, I mentioned that there's a sort of a political will developing in certain contexts, which I think as gerontologists and students of aging and people who are aging ourselves, we have to take very seriously. This is an example from Australia. It's a book called Generation Less, written by someone in the Labour Party who should really know better, called Jennifer Rayner. And her hypothesis is that we spent too much on the dreaded baby boomers, and maybe we should redistribute this to people such as herself, who are in their mid-20s. The Grattan Institute, which is an influential policy institute in Australia, has produced a report called The Wealth of Generations, where it makes a similar argument that Australian public pension policy should reduce the benefits to older generations and transfer that to other age groups in what they call generational rebalancing. And in 2018, there was even a pressure group launched itself called Think Forward to try and make this happen, make it so. It isn't just an Australian phenomenon. In the UK, there have been a series of books written by Hauke and Malik talking about the jilted generation, and you can trace this through a certain political school of thought, which started with the Conservative Party Policy Exchange, writing a book called What Future for Maggie's Children, that laid it on those far too liberal boomers again, although having grown up in that period, I always thought Margaret Thatcher had something to do with stealing our futures, but there you go. David Willits, who wrote a book called The Pinch, about how the baby boomers have stolen our futures, and the development of another pressure group, the Intergenerational Foundation, who have started something they call a Fairness Index. And the Fairness Index says, well, how far do oldies get, and how much should younger people get? And let's change that equation. Now, the question about these things it isn't just about a rhetorical debate. It's an attempt to change the direction of welfare debate, the way we think about welfare when we take a life course perspective. And of course, given its genealogy, it avoids talking about structural inequality and its escalation, which could be used to ameliorate a lot of the issues that we face at present. And this is one way of thinking about what's going on. If we try and model the thinking behind this increasing amplification of generational rivalry, you can say, well, we normally think, if you look at the bottom bit there and we move up, we think of the welfare systems that we have as addressing points of vulnerability across the life course. So in childhood, in pregnancy, in working life if you fall out of work, and in old age, points where you become vulnerable and the state has a duty to step in or NGOs or whichever system you have, has a duty to step in to deal with these points of vulnerability. I think what we're seeing with this increasing emphasis on generational rivalry is that we're not talking about points of vulnerability anymore. We're talking about younger versus older. How is this going to work? Why have one lot got stuff and the other lot think they haven't got stuff? Now that changes the model, changes the underlying structure of the way the debate is beginning to develop, and we have to really challenge this. So when we look at the emerging landscape, economists seem to think they've solved the problem. We work longer, we reduce pensions, we stay the same, or basically get off the bus. In terms of psychosocial awareness, we have this different narrative about different life phases that have different priorities and contributions to make. Life course change means adapting to new priorities as they come up. And then we have this one-sided view of generational precarity, fueling generational antagonism. So how do we deal with this? Well, I'm not going to say I know the answer, but I think Ariella and I have been working for some years on trying to pose questions which can help us interrogate this sort of situation. A while ago now, when was it, Ariella? 2011? Yeah. We wrote a book called Generational Intelligence, and we were really coming out of studying elder abuse together, but we had wider concerns about relations between age groups in society. And we posed the question, how far is it possible to put yourself in the shoes of someone of a different age group? Because there seemed to be a problem of empathy between age groups that we felt we needed to begin to explore. And we came up with 3 dimensions of ways of trying to think about where you stand in relation to other generations and how we can make a bridge between these different life priorities yet shared activities. So we said, first of all, first thing to do is to become conscious of yourself as part of a generation or age group. If you're not conscious of your own situation and your own priorities, the tendency is to assume that everybody is the same as you, which means you assume that your priorities in your age group are universally valid. If you don't move beyond that, then you'll make a lot of mistakes in terms of setting up services, in terms of what older people may want, in terms of what it's like to be in a different age group. If you address that first question about where do you sit, the second one is, to what degree are people capable of putting themselves in the position of the other? Because once you recognize that people are different, then there's a question, how do you communicate across that? This person is not the same as me, this person is different to me. Yeah, that person has a different set of priorities. And finally, once you've recognized that people have legitimate differences as well as continuities, then how do we negotiate between groups? How do we negotiate intergenerationally sustainable solutions? And we came up with a few pointers. Firstly, these solutions have to endure over time, which is a big policy challenge, given that mostly our parliaments have limited lives, and you've got to get continuity of policy so people can predict their lives more certainly. You need to contain the ambivalence between generational groups. Let's not assume we all naturally get on. We don't. But we need to be able to contain that, to make it work. Recognize that we have mixed feelings. We both love and hate our parents and sometimes our children as well. But that doesn't mean that we can't live with each other. Recognize this diversity between age groups and find those negotiated settlements. Where are the places where we can begin to prefigure ways of working together and see these connections? So I'm not going to tell you this is the policy today, this is what we should do, but what I am going to do is go through a few ways of beginning to critically engage with any policy or intervention that you might come across and say, well, how can I make sense of this? What is it actually saying about aging? How can we age-proof, if you like, the thing that we're looking at? And again, this is perhaps ridiculously simple, but it took a very long time for me to get around to thinking about it, which I apologize for. And I'm going to put forward 4 ways of thinking that may be of interest to you. The first is to look at degrees of positive and negative othering, and I'll go into a tiny bit more detail in a sec. The second is to how do we negotiate continuity and discontinuity. The third is, are we within age or between age thinking when we develop a policy or a care program or a new university? And are we present or lifetime centered? Are we thinking in the here and now, or are we thinking on a broader or more extensive time scale? So positive and negative othering, well, as gerontologists, we're used to thinking about negative othering, that when we look at age-based prejudice and antagonism is where we start from, and we try and see it as a rights issue or a similar sort of issue. What I'm suggesting is that there's also a positive value to each age, which means that we have to look at the complementary relationships between different age groups. So we're very good at looking at negative othering, seeing the other as a negative person. We're not so good at looking at positive othering. What makes this other person distinctive? And then how can we build on that to all get round the table and put something on the table together? Continuity and discontinuity, or change, as we often think of this. For me, continuity is often used to avoid or deny age-based life course change, whereas discontinuity recognises changes that occur as the life course progresses. And this is partly because I started off as a social and developmental psychologist, so the fact that people change as they grow older is not a surprise. The surprise is when you come to policies that don't seem to really take this into account. And most people value continuity of identity. They want to be seen as the same person, but discontinuity of priority. You might be the same person, but what you want when you're 40, when you're 60, and when you're 80 can be quite different. So let's take that into account. Within and between, well, if a new policy comes up, or you're thinking of building a new service, ask, how far is it only looking at age issues on their own? Or how far is it looking at the connections between different age groups and how they work if you implement this policy? How far are the interconnections with other life phases and social issues examined? Present and lifetime centeredness. How far do policies, theories and interventions focus only on the here and now? Or how far do they look at the effects upon the life course and life changes over time, over a lifetime? And I think when we look at pensions policy, we can see some of the problems and contradictions that have arisen because we have often taken a here and now view, but not a lifetime view of the consequences of our policies. Now, I'll finish by offering a couple of ways that we might begin to build alternatives. Firstly, we're not starting with just those two narratives. When I was looking at this, I came up with four leading narratives which seem to be imbued within the way that gerontology thinks about its subject. Firstly, there's the emphasis on work and working life. It's good at keeping some people economically active, but bad at recognizing broader values that the gift of longevity gives us. Health, an obvious narrative, good for well-being, but increasingly challenged by complex problems such as dementia, and diversions such as whether anti-aging medicine works or not. Spirit. Spirit is an under-researched issue in gerontology. But what it does, which the other discourses don't really do, is address vulnerability and suffering. It gives us a narrative for understanding those positions, rather than avoiding them or denying them. And family, which Ariella and other people, Merrill and others in this room have studied extensively, gives us insight into forms of emotional intergenerational connection and how to think about the diversity there, and takes into account life course difference. When we think of the family, we think of children, parenting, grandparenting. This takes difference into account almost without thinking. Now, what does this mean in terms of content? I think we should explore alternative contributions to work for the value of specific priorities in a long life. We should work towards intergenerational sustainability. We should take the best from these existing narratives to create a sort of bank of alternatives. And one of the projects I'd really like to get going is get a bank of cultural diversity around different ways of aging, and then put it online and let people vote on which one they'd like to have. We need to recognize the precarity of generations, and this isn't just a threat, it's also a source of solidarity. We are all facing uncertainty and precarity. So let's build alliances based on that. And finally, to connect to the other major social shifts, societal shifts, as previous speakers have been saying, climate action, migration, wealth inequality, these things are all interdependent. They all interact with how we deal with population aging. So just to come back to those questions at the beginning, what is the purpose of a long life? Well, I reckon, culturally speaking, we need time to let it emerge. And it's an amalgam of these existing narratives, life course priorities, and these interconnections. And we mustn't jump in and say, oh, we've solved the problem. We haven't solved the problem. It'll take time to emerge. Let's take that time as a culture to allow alternatives to develop and for us to understand them. How do we adapt to a society where generations will be approximately the same size? Well, I think we have to recognize the distinctiveness, but also the generational complementarity that comes with shared precarity. So recognize that people can be distinctive, that's not a problem, and also that this is a complementary and not a situation of antagonism that can be nudged into reality. And finally, how do we do this? We need to be much better at identifying spaces for intergenerational cooperation and innovative community activities. Well, thank you for enduring this. I've been told that we can't have questions because people in this country will go on forever arguing the toss around it. So apologies for that, but I'm very happy to talk to people outside of this lectern if you would like to.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite our talented colleague from our faculty, Dr. Michal Isaacson. Dr. Michal Isaacson is an assistant professor at Haifa University, gerontology department, trained as an urban geographer at Hebrew University and transformed to the gerontologist at MIT Age Lab. Her research focuses on the intersection of technology, mobility, and lifestyle in late life. Dr. Isaacson's research has spanned Israel, the US, Germany, Spain, and India, and has been acknowledged by the KAI Innovation Award as well as Rothschild postdoctoral fellowship.
תוך כדי שאני מסדרת, קודם כל תודה רבה לכל הקולגות שלי בחוג על הפרגון. זה לא מובן מאליו בכלל, תודה. ואני עכשיו צריכה למצוא מצגת. אופס. Okay, so I'm so happy to be here today, and I know that I'm the talk that stands between you and lunch, so I'm going to try to keep this brief and interesting. My talk today is going to be in 3 acts, just like one of my favorite podcasts. So we're going to start by talking about opportunities and challenges for gerontechnology. This sounds very boomy. I'm okay, okay. Opportunities and challenges for gerontechnology. We're going to talk about entrepreneurs, which I think is very, very interesting, and we have some research that was done here in Haifa, and for all our guests coming to the Startup Nation, we have to talk about entrepreneurs because they're the engine behind our technology and one of the things that makes our country very wonderful. And at the end, we'll talk about the future, some thoughts about where this is all going and what we're going to be seeing in the future. So let's jump right in and talk about opportunities and challenges for gerontechnology. And as you all know, because we've seen today and we've all seen in the past, the world is aging. I know that's not new to anybody, and there are lots of challenges that come from an aging world. In this talk, I'm not going to be talking about anything medical, so the whole world of medicine and health is put aside for my talk. And I'm going to be talking about other aspects of life that technology interacts with. And I want to talk about three main focuses that are very interesting for technology. One is day-to-day living. Maintaining independence and being able to live at home requires a lot of capabilities and requires to do many things, and technology can help there. As you can see, we have our little robot. Another aspect that changes as we age is social interaction, and technology can help maintain social interaction and connection. And the last that I'm not really going to be talking about today, but I really feel that no presentation can be full without, are aspects of caregiving. Caregiving is so important in our world, and technology has a lot to do to caregiving. Any technology that we have that can help caregivers and can make their jobs easier is wonderful technology that is really needed, but we're not going to really talk about that. So we have these needs, and as you know, these needs have been addressed in many different types of technologies. Gary, yeah, something's wrong with the, I also feel a little, what? Step back, okay. Here, is this better? Much better, okay, I also feel better. So as we can see, not good. Okay, I'm getting told not good, but, so I'm a little confused. How about this? Okay. So we know that there are many technologies that have already jumped into these spaces and are helping us, and these are technologies that we all use. Many of us have robots that clean our floors, and all of us have cell phones, and we have a lot of interesting technologies in the caregiving space. So I'm going to start out by talking about two technologies. One, the first will be in the social technology, and I want to talk about social robots, social robotics. I want to show you two videos, two very different videos, and use these videos as a way to discuss what we're seeing now in the social robotics domain. So here we go. Let's see if this works. I think we're missing the sound. You see. What do we do? What do we do? Hold on. We go back. The sound people are not here. We're missing sound. Doesn't concern anybody. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, I think, okay, I'm bringing it all the way up, and I think I'm going to use this microphone that's really annoying for me, and maybe this will work.
This is your house. This is your car. This is your toothbrush. These are your things. But these are the things that matter. And somewhere in between is this guy. Introducing Jibo, the world's first family robot. Say hi, Jibo.
Hi, Jibo.
Jibo helps everyone out throughout their day. He's the world's best cameraman. By intelligently tracking the action around him, he can independently take video and photos, so that you can put down your camera and be a part of the scene.
Jibo, take the picture.
He's a hands-free helper. You can talk to him, and he'll talk to you back, so you don't have to skip a beat.
Excuse me, Anne?
Yes, Jibo.
Melissa just sent a reminder that she's picking you up in half an hour to go grocery shopping.
Thanks, Jibo.
He's an entertainer and educator. Through interactive applications, Jibo can teach.
Let me in, or else I'll blow your house in.
Hey, where'd
at whoever you want with a simple tap of your finger.
Check out my turkey dinner, Mom.
I wish you wouldn't eat that.
Hey, they make turkey pizza? I want turkey pizza.
And he's a platform, so his skills keep expanding. He'll be able to connect to your home.
Welcome home, Eric.
Hey, buddy. Can you order some takeout for me?
Sure thing. Chinese, as usual?
You know me so well.
And even be a great wingman.
You have a voice message from Ashley. Want to hear it?
Absolutely.
Hey, call me when you're home.
Better make that takeout for two, Jibo.
We've dreamt of it for years, and now he's finally here. And he's not just an aluminum shell, nor is he just a 3-axis motor system. He's not even just a connected device. He's one of the family. Jibo, this little bot of mine.
So would anybody like a Jibo? Yeah? Okay, so not only would you like Jibos, Jibo was a very popular Head Start campaign that was actually closed because so many people wanted Jibos. But I have another robot to show you, and this is actually an Israeli robot that some of you are familiar with. And let's look at another robot.
Mary, Megan sent a new photo. Would you like to look at it?
Yes, please. Oh, he's a gem.
Would you like to respond to Megan's post? Sure. Recording in 3, 2, 1.
LEQ reminds me to take my meds, arranges rides for me. She even reminds me of all my appointments.
Mary, don't forget bridge with the Golden Girls at 1 p.m. Would you like to practice?
Oh, I don't need to practice.
I didn't catch that. Do you want to play bridge or not?
Oh, fine. Let's play.
Mary, you wanted to Skype with Liz. Would you like to do that now?
Oh, sure, that sounds great. Hey, honey.
Hi, Mom.
Hey, I just noticed, is it a little cool in the house? Oh, it feels great. I'm doing my Tai Chi now. Yeah, I can see.
Okay, Mom. Just checking in. You take care.
I'm fine, sweetie. Chat later.
There's a new TED Talk waiting for you if you'd like to watch it. Or perhaps you could go for a walk.
That's a good idea, LEQ.
Great, Mary. I'll be right here when you get back.
Great.
Okay, so that was LEQ by Intuition Robotics. Who's familiar with Intuition Robotics? Nobody? Okay. So Intuition Robotics is an Israeli company that has been a big success as a startup company and has raised over $30 million. And Intuition Robotics is having a lot of difficulty with LEQ, as you can imagine. And I want to talk about the two very different approaches between Jibo, who's a robot for everyone, and LEQ, who's a robot for older adults. Just to say, when I saw that video, I even feel that video is ageist. Who's that lady? Why does she look like that? I don't know. My grandmother doesn't look like that. I hope I never look like that. It's patronizing. It's a complex video, I think, as a gerontologist to watch. So I want to talk about some of the challenges in the space of social robotics, because it's one of the spaces that we're seeing a lot of activity recently in the past few years. And the first challenge that we have is the challenge of cost and value. And cost and value come together. One of the questions that we ask ourselves many times when we're innovating for older adults is who's going to be paying for this, whatever we're creating? And the cost point makes the cost point very, very important. And when the cost is high, that means that we're basically moving ourselves out of the market of HMOs and other institutions that are not able to pay for our technology. So cost is a big deal. But cost comes together with value because, as we know, there is a lot of money out there, and if you're offering something that has real value, you can succeed. But social robots are having a big trouble answering the value question. When you want to sell someone a social robot, you have to say, what does this do? And you kind of find yourself squirming. It's difficult to answer that question. When I was working with Intuition Robotics, I would sit in my car after sitting with meetings with them and say to myself, wait, was that a robot? It was a screen. It didn't do anything. It just sat there. So social robots are hard to think about as robots, and it's hard for us today to understand their value or to perceive them as valuable. If we want to look at that from maybe a more theoretic point of view, we know that older adults are less excited about the novelty of new items, and that explaining a very clear value proposition is very important. So when we look at the hype cycle model, which is a model that I teach in my German technology class, and I know that many of our students are familiar with, we know that creating hype among older adults is different than it is in other populations. We don't have a good model, though, for hype among older adults. What would hype about a social robot look like if our population was older adults? How would maybe the line would continue in a different direction? What would that look like? We don't know yet, and we need research for that. No, skip this. The other big question that social robotics has to answer and is facing today is are questions of user experience. And this is some very interesting research that's going on in this sphere right now about using voice interaction as a user interface. It makes a lot of sense and could be argued both ways. On one hand, voice is the most simple and our initial way of interacting with the world. A child learns how to say more and gets more food on their plate, so it should be the most intuitive way to interact with technology, on one hand. On the other hand, we know that a lot of the voice devices that are coming out, and here there's a picture of an Alexa, and we have them all around us now today, are facing some serious adoption issues. They're difficult to adopt. And one of the ways that I feel old is when I walk into the kitchen and I see my daughter interacting with Alexa. They say, like, hey, how'd you know how to do that? I had no idea you could do that. So there is something generational here, and I don't think that I'm difficult with technology. I love technology, and still she has different ways of interacting with this kind of robotic presence of Alexa in our home. So figuring out what user experience, what voice commands and the user experience would be for older adults is something that's very interesting today. The last aspect, I think that's very important, and there's also a big body of research that's being conducted right now, and studies keep on coming back with both directions, is when we think about social robots, how effective are they actually as companions? And we talked about loneliness earlier today. Can a social robot elevate loneliness? Is that possible? Do we need humans to feel not lonely? I don't know. I have a very strong feeling that there are strong cohort effects here, and maybe if we go back to my daughter, we'll find different answers with her. So those are social robots that are very interesting and receiving a lot of attention today. Another technology that's very interesting and is very hot in the aging market are technologies of smart homes. And I think we've all been there. We've seen what smart homes can do, and we could say, oh, that's great. I can make sure that grandma doesn't leave the fire on in the kitchen. We can keep her home safer. That's wonderful. We know that grandma got up in the morning and that everything's okay. And there's a lot of potential for aging in place and for maintaining independence in smart home technologies on one hand. And on the other hand, they're not being received among older adults like we thought that they would be. And there's a lot of resistance to smart home technologies. I want to show you very quickly, so we a very small study, but that I think was interesting. So one of the big aspects that smart homes, the difficulties that smart homes encounter are issues of privacy. Because who wants somebody in your home tracking you and knowing what you do? So we said, that is a big concern, and let's use very simple sensors. We're only going to use open and closed sensors, so no cameras, none of those globe sensors that you put on the ceiling that nobody's really sure what they're doing. Only open and closed sensors, and we designed a system, and it's up here, but it really doesn't matter what the system looked like, and we had a lot of fun printing a case, a 3D case, that's always fun. And we went to our 85-plus lifestyle leaders panel. This is in a laboratory that I'm associated with. And we brought our project, this was like a summer project with an intern, and we were very excited about it, and we brought it to the members of our lifestyle panel, all excited, explaining how this can keep them in touch with their children, and their children will be able to see that, that they're okay and that they're safe, and we use them on doors and windows so the home would be safe. We thought this would be very exciting to these people, and we got some interesting feedback. The first thing that people told us, and you'll hear this about many technologies, is that if you're going to give me technology that is going to replace human interaction, I do not want your technology, and I don't care what it means. I just do not want to participate in this technology. And people were very concerned that if they had a smart home and their children were able to monitor them from far, we wouldn't be extending care. We were calling this extending care, but we'd actually be rolling care back, and people would be left with less care than they have today. And they'd be missing those phone calls of, "Mom, how are you doing?" And people just weren't willing to subscribe to that, and they were very upset by that prospect. So that's one thing that needs to be taken into consideration, and it's something that you'll hear a lot about several different technologies. But what we found really interesting in this study was actually something else. We had a real difficulty explaining to people, again, what the value proposition of a smart home is. And you come in all excited and you say, it could turn on the lights for you. And then you get kind of like a look. I know how to turn on the lights. I don't need the lights to be turned on. And then you say, oh, but you can use your microwave without touching it. And again, I know how to use my microwave. So explaining to people what the value of a smart home is very difficult, because when you think about it, it doesn't really give you new capabilities. It gives you a different way, a new way to do the things that you're doing already. And that makes things a little bit more difficult in explaining what the value proposition is. And then the second part did come back to privacy. And a lot of people were concerned with their privacy, even though we explained many times that these are very simple sensors and no cameras, but people were still concerned with their privacy. And I think that leads us to a very important understanding. And that is that technology is always a compromise on privacy. We all compromise our privacy when we have cell phones, when we have email accounts. We're compromising our technology all the time. But the reason that we do it is because we see value in whatever we're receiving from this technology that we're interacting with. And if we take older adults, or we take people that do not perceive value from whatever from the technology that we're giving them or that they're using, is it okay to compromise their privacy? Maybe that doesn't make sense anymore. Maybe that's something that's not ethical and not something that we should think is acceptable. So those are the main challenges when we think about smart homes. And now I want to move on to Act 2, and I want to talk about entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs are very special here in Israel, in our startup nation. And I'm not going to talk about data. There's a lot of American data about how entrepreneurs are young, and even though there are many entrepreneurs that are old, actually, they're funded poorly when compared to younger entrepreneurs. So we see a lot of innovation, actually, that people over the age of 45, usually that's when you look at this data, over the age of 45 means you're older. So entrepreneurs and innovators over the age of 45 have a lot of activity, but that activity isn't as well accepted as the activity of younger entrepreneurs. And I have a wonderful master's student, Rina Naor, who is very active in the Gerontech community here in Israel, and she went out and decided to ask entrepreneurs what influenced their decision to consider older adults as a target market. She did a survey among 100 entrepreneurs using a lot of her connections, and she started out with a big model. That looks a little funky on Windows. Thinking that there are 3 main domains that should probably influence in entrepreneurs' willingness to consider older adults as a target market. And I just want to frame this and say that these aren't classic or necessarily classic gerontech innovations. These are things that everybody can use, but that could be very useful for older adults, and it would make a lot of sense to consider older adults as one of the first populations that you'd roll out to. So those are the questions that she was asking. And she considered 3 domains. The first domain is people's attitude towards older adults, thinking that ageist approaches and ageist bias would make people not as willing to interact with older adults and consider them as a target market. Looking at the people's personal attributes, who they are, where they come from, their age. We thought the age would be a very strong way to explain the willingness of entrepreneurs to consider older adults as their target market. And the last was knowledge, how much people actually knew about aging, the process of aging, what it entailed, and what the gerontech market looked like. And what was interesting is that age was the first that came back, totally not relevant, had no influence. The business role, it didn't matter if this was the CEO, the CFO, the CTO. We thought maybe the technology people wouldn't be so hot on aging. It didn't make a difference. The whole attitude, the whole ageist, looking for ageist approaches, came back empty. Ageism, although people were ageist, people are very ageist in Israel, it was not associated with their willingness to consider older adults as a target population. And what was found to be actually the most significant was their knowledge about aging and their knowledge about the potential that the aging market has, and also the area of expertise, which kind of made sense. Things that were closer to healthcare made people more willing to consider older adults as their target market. But I think that these results, the results of this study are very interesting because they give us a clear path and a good idea about how we can change something that's very fundamental in the gerontech sphere, and that is the activity of the entrepreneurs. And this shows us that by education and that by starting dedicated programs for entrepreneurs in the space of gerontech, we might be seeing more innovation and more companies that are willing to work with older adults and are thinking are considering them as part of their target population. And Israel now has several different attempts at trying to put gerontech in the startup nation and in the entrepreneur space in a more dominant way. So that was the entrepreneurs, and now we're getting close to the end of my talk, and we're going to talk about the future. I showed this to a friend, and the friend said, do you think people are going to be losing their minds? Are they going to be disintegrating? So no. I'm not sure if that's the best image. But when we think about the future, I think that we have a lot to think about. And I think that I'm very excited to see where gerontech is going to be going and what new innovation we're going to be seeing in this space. And I think there's several questions that we should be asking ourselves. The first question that we should be asking ourselves is, who are we innovating for? And that question can be answered in several different ways. Are we innovating for ourselves because we hope to be old one day? Are we innovating for the people that are already old? Maybe. Are we innovating for our children? That's one way to look at this question. And the other way to look at this question is, where in the world are these people located? And a lot of the innovation that we see in the gerontech scene is geared toward North America and Europe and the global north, while most of the older adults live in the global south. I mean, you think about potential, that is where there's tremendous potential that is not being addressed in any way. So that is really probably not low-hanging fruit, but hopefully there's fruit there that might need effort, but could be picked. So that's the world. If we look at the world today, already more than half of the people in the world are living, the older adults. And if we look at the world in 2050, it's very obvious that that's the direction and that's what we should be looking at. So that's one question, one way to look at who we're innovating for. And another way to look at who we're innovating for is to think about the different cohorts that we have and about their experiences and most of all, their expectations. Because I think the big question that we should be asking ourselves, it was not what are people going to need? Because I think that we saw that through the smart home and even the social robot, that a lot of this isn't about need. A lot of this is about want. what are people going to want? What is going to make people want to put their hand in their pocket and buy our new innovation? And you've seen this graph that as we see different generations aging, there's a gap in expectations that opens, and that gap is potential. So addressing that gap and understanding that gap is really should be a big focus in how we move forward. And when I see this, is Sigal here? Sigal is in here. Sigal is here. I have a slide for Sigal, because when I see this graph, there's one thing that I think when I see it. Okay, boomers, you want it, you got it. Yeah, Sigal and I have been talking a lot about okay boomers, but you know, the boomers drive a lot of the market right now, and if that's what the boomers want, okay boomers. So that's an okay boomers, not in an ageist way, in an actually anti-ageist way. Yeah, so that's one way of thinking of it. And then the last thing that I think that we should be thinking about, that I started to talk about just now, is what is gerontechnology? What is this space that we think that has so much potential in an aging world? Is it in the health sphere? Is it in the assistive device type of area? Or is there something else? Is it a space that we can innovate in and address higher needs of people in ways that are not the way that we've been thinking about them till today? And I want to finish with a quote, one of my favorite quotes of Joe Coughlin, who's a mentor to me, that really stresses that we have to think of people and of aging, of an older adults as people, and that that has to reflect in the products and in the innovation that we're serving to these people. Thank you.